I want to mention a few settings that I have customized in my Fusion or in my DaVinci Resolve installation. And there are a few settings related to the interface and related to performance that you might want to check and perhaps want to change. So first of all, if you are in DaVinci Resolve, of course, please check your optimized media settings. Now, if you're using editing regularly, you know what I'm talking about. So under Preference, you have a media storage location. The first location is also used for your optimized media, which you're using on the edit page. And then you have in your project settings, just a very quick reminder, you have here under master settings, optimized media and render cache. This is the render cache on the edit page, and your Fusion effects that you're building on the Fusion page will later be rendered on the edit page and saved in the formats that are selected here. So you want to make sure that you have selected some settings here which your PC can play back smoothly. Right, so for me, I'm using the DNxHR versions, but you can also go to something with a lower bandwidth if you have storage constraints, or going even to uncompressed if you have CPU constraints, or the Cineform, which are GPU accelerated. Now, this is more from the Resolve editing perspective. From a Fusion perspective, one thing I would recommend checking is your RAM usage. So under Preferences in DaVinci Resolve, you have here memory and GPU. And you have here a setting for limit Resolve memory usage and limit Fusion cache. Now, the Fusion cache is always much lower than the Resolve cache, and actually it's more than 10 GB lower here, at least on my installation, what I can set here. So you see that DaVinci Resolve is reserving quite a bit of overhead, which is not available for Fusion. And even the maximum here for Resolve is limited to a good portion less than what I actually have in my system memory. In Fusion Studio, you actually have a little bit more control here. Let me go to Fusion Studio and show you the equivalent settings under File, Preferences, Global and Default Settings. And then you have here Memory. And here you have a slider which can go all the way up to 100%, and then you can say how much memory should at least be left over after Fusion fills everything. I have my setting on 80% because I also sometimes have more than one application open and I use the screen recording software and so on. Otherwise, if I was using only Fusion, I might actually increase it a bit more, and of course this all depends on how much RAM you have in total and how much you need otherwise. But here I actually 80% is much more than I have in Resolve. Not only these 10-15 gigabytes that Resolve saves extra besides Fusion, but also 80% is already higher than my maximum that I can set on the Resolve page. But it is what it is. So this is a setting you might want to increase and then test if it's working stable. If not, leave it the way it is. In Fusion Studio, you have a setting for simultaneous branching and for during the interactive renderer, and for the final renderer you can have multiple frames at once, and this you can control. So this is regarding the CPU parallelization. So depending on how many cores you have, you can experiment with this, and you might get a bit of faster rendering if you use the simultaneous branching and the multiple frames at once, depending on your CPU. This branching is available in Fusion Studio. As per my knowledge, it is not yet realized in DaVinci Resolve. I'm not sure if it will come anytime soon. I think it's a reasonable thing, but maybe because of Resolve's GPU focus, it's maybe something they are not prioritizing. Now, since we are in the preferences here in Fusion Studio, let's have a look at this path map. Here I enable the reverse mapping for non-user path. This means that when I have saver nodes or loader nodes, that they save the path relative to the place where my composition is stored. So if I put a saver node here, for example, saver and save some tests here, you see that here it says comp/test. So I have a relative path in my saver instead of having my complete file path. The advantage of this is that I can move this composition together with its source media, and the file path still remains valid as long as everything is in that folder where the composition here is saved. So this way I can provide it to you. You can open it in the same folder. As long as you don't move the media somewhere else, it remains in place. Now in DaVinci Resolve, this setting is also available, but it's less relevant because you save your Fusion scripts usually as part of the Resolve project. So you don't manually do the loader and saver thing you do in Fusion Studio. So that's why the setting there is less relevant. One setting which I have also here in the Fusion preferences, which is available both in Fusion Studio and Resolve, is the interface color. Now, why would I talk about interface color? Well, by default, Fusion comes with a blue color cast and DaVinci Resolve as well. And I am not a colorist, I am not in a grading suit, but I like to have the view in front of me somewhat neutral, because I do make color judgments in Fusion. I do at least relative, compare color between foreground, background, and so on, but sometimes also absolute when you design motion graphics or so. So I think it's good for the eye to look at something neutral. And you have here under user interface in the global settings, use gray background interface. And that's why my Fusion is gray and not bluish. The same in DaVinci Resolve. Here you find it under DaVinci Resolve preferences, and then under the user preferences in the UI settings, you can enable background interface and gray background in viewers. You can enable these two settings. This is regarding the settings. If you change anything there, you need to restart Resolve or restart Fusion, and next time it will be enabled. Another thing regarding the interface, if you want, you can disable some toolbars to get more space. And actually, I would really do this if I wasn't recording tutorials, because I know sometimes when you're using too many keyboard shortcuts, especially in beginner tutorials and YouTube tutorials and so on, you are confusing people. So I leave the interface here pretty much the way it is by default. Here on the lower menu, I have disabled these the text here and put show icons only. This gives me a little bit of space, but I still keep the icons here enabled, so people see me doing it when I switch from the edit page to the Fusion page. If you can remember just one shift key and a few numbers, you find here that you can change the page with the shift and then the number. So shift 4 is shift 5 is Fusion, shift 8 is deliver. If you can remember this, then you can just disable this page navigation and you have more space here. And again, I would be doing this if I wasn't recording here. So I enable it again. This bar here, if you disable this, then this is maybe a bit more advanced. Personally, I am very fast with the control spacebar menu in Fusion, and I'm very used to it. I also know some of these shortcuts here, these 3-letter or 4-letter acronyms. Not all, but I know the ones that I'm using all the time. So for me, I can very quickly get tools just from the keyboard. Just, I need a background tool, here it is. I want to merge a text tool, here it is, right? I want a color corrector, here's the color corrector, a blur, right? And another merge, here it is, and so on, right? So I'm pretty fast with the keyboard with this. So I don't really need this absolutely, and I might consider turning it off, which you can do under Fusion show toolbar here. Or if you are on Fusion Studio, you can change it here as well. So in Fusion Studio, it's under View Toolbar. Here, you can disable it if you want to. So if you are quick with keyboard shortcuts, I think you can disable it. Personally, I keep it enabled because this way you can see which tool I'm clicking. And I think for tutorial recordings, maybe that's better. Another thing, if you right-click here on the grid, there is an option Arrange Tools to Grid. I always have this enabled, so this way the tools are lined up like this. and it's all organized a bit better. So just visually I find it easier, and I find it easier to organize my flow this way. So by default I think it's not enabled. If your tools are somewhere else, you can click line up tools to grid and they will automatically be connected to the grid, but for me they are there by default. Same setting in Fusion, in DaVinci Resolve, and in Fusion Studio. One last setting to consider is the proxy and auto proxy. So proxy, when it's enabled, means that all calculations are done on a lower resolution. Auto proxy means that calculations, that your display is going onto a lower resolution while you are changing or adjusting any parameters or zooming in the display. So for like on-the-fly calculations while changing parameters or so, while you're doing that, it goes to the auto proxy and then goes back. Turn it off when you are working on very detailed stuff like edge detail and things where each pixel matters, and you can turn it on when you're doing like general arrangements and motion graphics and stuff like this. So here you have it in the menu. In Fusion Studio you have here dedicated buttons for this. For these dedicated buttons, you also can do a right click on the proxy and auto proxy, and when you do it you see the level of the proxy resolution and can select it. So if I put it to 3, then it means that for the proxy each 1 and 3 pixels is being calculated while the proxy is on. Or if I put it to 4, it means each 1 and 4 pixels is being calculated. Same with the auto proxy. In DaVinci Resolve you have the setting hidden in the Fusion menu, so you have to go into the Fusion settings, and here you have the setting here for the auto proxy and the standard proxy in the general settings of Fusion. Okay, these are the basic settings I recommend checking and that I have set. Otherwise I pretty much use the default. If there's anything else coming up in the course I will mention it where it belongs, and this should be good for your setup to get started.